Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
Our scheduled speaker, who is Tracy Shildrick from Teesside, unfortunately, she's unavoidably not able to come tonight, but we're very fortunate to have Bill Davies standing in, and this is his area of expertise. Bill is from IPPR North, so we're really fortunate and grateful to Bill for standing in at the last minute for us. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Bill to talk to us about unemployment. Thank you.
Right, welcome everyone. Thanks for having me. Today I'm going to do a particularly non-controversial topic of unemployment and people on benefits. My research background was in unemployment programmes. I did a PhD on looking at the privatisation of active labour market programmes, as they are known, or welfare to work, at the University of Liverpool, and I've since joined IPPR about a year ago now. I'm still doing research on it now. In particular, we're looking at the performance of the work programme. Some of you may have caught that in the headlines quite regularly, it appears. There's been recent stuff on how badly it's doing, for instance, for people who've moved off incapacity benefit. And that continues, I suppose, to be my research area. So, Shirkers and Strivers. I don't really like this language, but I'm going to try and engage with it. What I want to do is, I want to very, very briefly tell you really what skiving means, I suppose. I want to try and cover some of the origins, of which my understanding is they came from the United States and permeated here from the 1980s onwards. And I also want to say kind of about the pervasiveness of this challenge, I suppose, of running against quite visceral public attitudes towards the welfare state. I'm going to proceed to explain why actually this might not be particularly helpful in my line of work, which is public policy, and how sometimes that leads to good policies, sometimes that leads to bad policies, and then I might finish on a soapbox and have a small rant, but I'll try and avoid that at all costs. So, skivers. What do skivers mean? The strivers versus skivers debate. You hear it from politicians of all stripes. George Osborne's classic narratives is about you going to work while somebody's got their blinds closed. Nick Clegg talks of alarm clock Britain. Ed Miliband is, I suppose, some ways divisive, talking about the squeezed middle, though I suspect talking about the squeezed bottom would be politically problematic in some respects. But in any case, these are popular narratives that people will have noticed. A skiver, the attitude to skiver is, I think, broadly that unemployed people are to blame for being unemployed. If only they tried harder, if only they changed their attitude, or indeed if they changed the structures around them, then they wouldn't be unemployed. For a lot of people, of course, this is a complete fallacy, but I will come on to that. But these are very popular narratives. These are not just some things politicians say. These appear to be things that the general public believe. The British Social Attitude Survey is particularly good at picking these things up. The British Social Attitude Survey asks a range of questions about people's perception of public life, people's perceptions of welfare, public services, etc. And one of the questions it asks is, how much do you agree or disagree that if welfare benefits were not so generous, people would learn to stand on their own 2 feet? The responses over the past 3 decades show that the perception of benefit dependency has moved from a position where 58% of people asked disagreed. They didn't think this was right, that actually welfare benefits aren't that generous. Now the position has very strongly reversed. 70% of people think that if welfare benefits were not so generous, then people would be able to stand on their own 2 feet. Any cursory glance at the British Social Attitude Survey will find these mirrored as well in other questions about the welfare state. Though the NHS, of course, always tends to be not treated as being the welfare state. Read into that what you will. There has been a blip. Since the coalition entered power, the most recent BSA has shown actually there's a slight decline in people thinking this, but by and large, it still holds. I think it's too early to point to any trend anyway in the reversal of this attitude. So clearly, a majority of the population still believes that unemployment benefits are too high and they discourage work, and that the unemployed could find work if they wanted to do so. My director, Nick Pearce, head of IPPR, spends a lot of time with political parties, and they also find very visceral attitudes to benefit scroungers, in inverted commas. So political calculations about welfare reform very much play into the public policy debate. Where do these attitudes come from? Well, these attitudes are not new. William Beveridge, for instance, wrote in his seminal welfare reform, the report on pensions and allied services, as it was glamorously titled, that people should actually be forced to take training or regular activity of some description if they could not find employment. That hero of the left and the Liberal Party clearly was involved in this debate as well. But, I mean, from my research, I found a particular series of academic debates in the 1980s and onwards that were quite influential on American public policy, but also British public policy. So, let's start. Firstly, George Gilder, American academic, wrote in 1981, "Our welfare system creates moral hazards because the benefits have risen to a level higher than the ostensible returns of going to work." He wasn't the only one espousing this view at the time. One of the more notorious academics was Charles Murray, who some of you may have heard of. Charles Murray is controversial for 1,001 reasons. But he wrote a very popular book in the 1980s called Losing Ground. And Losing Ground alleged that effectively the welfare system has created its own social strata, what was known as the underclass. It alleged that the over-generous benefit system in America had led to a significant underclass of several million Americans. Who was he referring to? Well, actually, by and large, he was referring to African-American men and single mothers. It argued that unemployment had been created and it had sustained a class of people who were unemployed and gradually becoming unemployable. These people he described as being at the bottom of society. Murray's thesis goes a bit further, though. He claims that blame must be attributable to the benefit system. He argued that the existence of a benefits trap, this is something that's very popular in today's parlance, and the disincentive effects of welfare rights. In particular, he was worried about the effects of a welfare state on young people, people who'd never had to, I suppose, work before the welfare state had really reached its advent. He said, "To someone who is not yet persuaded of the satisfactions of making one's own way, there is something laughable about a person who doggedly keeps working at a lousy job for no tangible reason at all. And when working no longer provides either income or status, the last reason for working has truly vanished. The man who keeps working is, in fact, a chump." So, the increase in welfare generosity relative to the gains of low-paid work had effectively created long-term unemployment. Murray argued, cut the cord, get rid of the welfare state, we don't need that anymore, that'll cure unemployment. Anyone who's inspected the American welfare state, though, will know that they have a very residual system, but at the moment have relatively, in American terms, high levels of unemployment. We might question, therefore, whether that's the most effective method. These attitudes, though, played into politics, as you'd expect. Many of you may remember Ronald Reagan's famous speech about welfare queens. Who was the welfare queen? Ronald Reagan says she has 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, and is collecting veterans' benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. She has a tax-free income of $150,000. When asked to explain who this person might be, naturally Reagan didn't have any specific examples. These attitudes crossed the shore. Over here, Margaret Thatcher observed welfare benefits, I'm not trying to do an impression, distributed with little or no consideration for their effects on behaviour, encourage illegitimacy, facilitated breakdown of families, replaced incentives favouring work, and self-reliance with perverse encouragement for idleness and cheating. Last but not least, and I think this individual might be the most important in these debates, mainly because he was an advisor to the British government in several successive incarnations, Lawrence Mead, or Larry Mead as he is also known. And he was a highly influential American academic. His view was actually slightly different. You keep a welfare state, but you could actually make it do more. And this is where actually some of our research comes in. His problem was that actually it wasn't that welfare entitlements existed, but they existed without any kind of activities or responsibilities associated with them. In fact, he provides one of my favourite brackets, least favourite quotes. He wrote, "The source of bondage for today's seriously poor is no longer social injustice, but the disorders of their private lives. For these Americans, the way forward is no longer liberation, but obligation." Mead's arguments have been very influential on successive British governments, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party in particular, with their emphasis on rights and responsibilities that many of you will remember. Frank Field, the Labour MP for Birkenhead, was also a very strong proponent of many of these ideas, which may come as a surprise. But of course, he was the employment minister under the Labour government before he was roundly sacked by Gordon Brown in a supposed fisticuff fight in the Cabinet Office. But that's a story for him to tell, as he often does. But successive governments are terrified of looking soft on welfare, Tony Blair in particular. So, there is a clear political, I suppose, impetus for politicians to do something about unemployment and to pursue harsh or tough welfare policies, as the Labour government called them. So, does hassling unemployed people work? In short, the answer is yes, but within limits it works. The effects of welfare to work programmes, according to the OECD and the World Bank and various other bits of research, if you just look at individual programme levels, yes, some of them do. For instance, the Restart programme, which happened under Margaret Thatcher, brought people more regularly into the job centres as they were then. They're not Job Centre Plus, but they were something equivalent. And if you recalled them in twice a year, then their chances of employment increased by 5%, and their chances of leaving the unemployment system, and this is quite an important distinction, rose by 7%. That is quite a lot to expect from an unemployment programme. People think they're going to cure unemployment, and this is one of the problems. They don't, but that is a reasonable impact. The New Deal for young people, Labour's famous flagship policy aimed at 18 to 24s, again, it achieved something similar, between 4 and 7%, depending on which measure you're looking. At the same time, governments have sanctions, which is the threat of taking someone's benefit away if they don't do what you want. This can be something simple like you haven't done your CV in time, or this can be not bothering to apply for a job when they've asked you to. Sanctions, there's been various research on them. Supposedly, they reduce benefit claiming by about 2.2 weeks, but they don't necessarily have the same impact on employment. And again, that might be a problem. In particular, deregistering people from the unemployment service is a bit of a problem if you want to get them to engage with the services that the employment providers are actually doing. So there is a bit of a tension in the sanctioning system. But what sanctioning does do, it pushes people into poverty. Successive JRF research has shown this. That is its explicit intent. It is to take people's money away so that they will conform to those activities. So, again, there's that tension. Is sanctioning a good or a bad thing? I'm going to leave that as a moot point, but I hope to come back to it perhaps in a little bit. I think the fundamental thing to say, though, is that welfare to work programmes can be positive, and they do show some impact on improving the likelihood of people entering employment. But there are caveats. The activities you're forcing people to do have to be useful. The last government's programme, the mandatory work-related activity, which effectively forced people to go into work at the equivalent of their job seekers allowance, had zero impact on levels of employment. These things matter. My research on the Flexible New Deal, which I did at the University of Liverpool, Flexible New Deal was another employment programme, and what it did was it demonstrated that the places that got the least people into work had the most intense competition for existing vacancies. So you have something called the JSA to vacancy ratio. It's the number of people looking for work compared to the number of available jobs. Lo and behold, the performance of the Flexible New Deal was strongest in the places that had the least competition for vacancies. And its performance was weakest where there were lots of job seekers scrabbling for individual jobs. This is profoundly important. The effectiveness of labour market attachment in this model found that For instance, in Bromsgrove, Walsall, West Bromwich, they were 35% less likely to enter employment than people in Surrey, Sussex, Brighton or Hove. Now, does that imply that the current system of active labour market programmes is going to be effective in solving unemployment? No, it doesn't. But politicians are very keen to press home that these will be a sort of miracle cure. But this is important in relation to the Skyver narrative as well. Okay, so let's take the start of the recession. I'll finish in just a moment. The finding of the Skyver narrative. At the start of the recession, the North East had 50,000 people claiming unemployment benefit. Now it has 80,000. The idea that the region has now somehow either acquired or identified 30,000 additional malingerers is, I think, fantasy. Nevertheless, unemployment programmes can make a difference and they should be used, but they have to be designed in an appropriate manner. What more we could do? There's a lot more we could do, and maybe we'll save that for the Q&A. Lots of people have lots of different ideas about what might work, and I've got a few, none of them necessarily too robust, some of them more robust than others, but we'll discuss those. But the problem is, if we let active labour market programmes carry on like the Flexible New Deal or the Work programme, it sort of lets policymakers off the hook and says, well, you've got your unemployment programme, you're forcing people into work, whatever employment whatever unemployment is left must be because they're not trying hard enough. And actually, I don't think that attitude is positive. It's not positive for the people, it's not positive for public finances, and it doesn't help anyone. Two things to finish on. Okay. One, policies that can garner influence on policymakers, but also sufficient public support while delivering on wider objectives are very important. We need to find policies that effectively the public will like and that will work. There's no point pursuing pie in the sky, I suppose, to paraphrase Keynes, bury a bag of gold and dig it up again, and that'll do. We need to find serious schemes that will do serious heavy lifting. The second, I think, is a bit of a wider point, that the ever-pervasive narratives on welfare queens and benefit scroungers permit a political environment which rewards politicians for punishing the unemployed without necessarily ameliorating unemployment. These are reflective strongly of opinion polling, but they may not necessarily be the best measures available to us. Without, I suppose, a different public outlook on what constitutes welfare, led by responsible media forces, public debate, and to some extent responsible politicians, the policies we use to combat unemployment will be limited, and the welfare state will continue to offer a residual safety net that we will, on the basis of public opinion polling, richly deserve. Thank you very much.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.